This is Ray Grant speaking. Welcome to Zodiac Killer Chronology. In this series of videos, I will walk the viewer through the Zodiac Killer case. This is Episode 2, Riverside Post-Mortem. On Monday morning, October 31, 1966, at about 6:30 a.m., the body of Sherry Bates was found in an alley just west of the Riverside City College Quad building. At 7:15 a.m., Riverside County Medical Examiner F. Renee Modglin was called at home about the possibility of a homicide. At 8:30 a.m., he was called at his office and told to proceed to 3680 Terracina Drive. At 9:03 a.m., he arrived at the crime scene and began his examination. The liver temperature, taken at 9:23 a.m., indicated Sherry Bates had been dead between 9 and 12 hours. The autopsy took place at Atchison and Graham Mortuary, less than a mile from Sherry's house, from 11 a.m. to 1:42 p.m. What follows is a paraphrase of the itemized details in layman's language. The notes are numbered as they are in the autopsy report. Here are the wounds to her face: 2, a 3/4 inch cut to the left upper lip with no loose or broken teeth. 3, a 3/4 inch bruise to both lips on the right side. 5, 2 3/4 inch cuts to the left cheek. 6, a 3/4 inch bruise to the left cheek and chin. 7, a 1-inch bruise to the mid-chin. Here are the wounds to her upper torso: 9, a 1/2-inch cut to the fold between right chest and shoulder. 10, a 1/2-inch nick to the upper left breast. 11, a 3/4 inch cut to the lower right breast. 13, a 1.5-inch cut to the upper right bicep. Here are the wounds to her hands and fingers: 14, a 1/2-inch bruise to the rear base of the right thumb. Several hairs were removed from the base of the right thumb. 15, light abrasions to the back of the right hand. 16, 2 short abrasions at the back of the right middle finger. 17, an abrasion to the back of the right ring finger. 18, dried blood over the hands and fingers. 19, 2 abrasions to the side of the right index finger. 20, a 1/2-inch abrasion to the second joint of the right little finger. 21, an abrasion to the base of the right little finger. 24, a Y-shaped laceration in the back of the left hand near the wrist. 25, an irregular cut to the middle of the back of the left hand. Of the 25 wounds listed in the autopsy, 19 are just shallow nicks and cuts. Of the remaining 6 wounds, an additional 4 are relatively superficial: 12, a 2/3 inch, moderately superficial, cut above the left 5th rib. There is a 1/2-inch oblique cut in the bony portion of the 5th rib. 22, a 3/4 inch deep cut to the base of the side of the right index finger. 23, 2 1.5-inch cuts to the inner left forearm near the elbow. 26, a 1/2-inch cut to the back of the left side. Even these 4 would more accurately be described as slashes than stab wounds. That leaves 2 of the 25 listed wounds that are more serious. 4, petechial hemorrhaging to the forehead and scalp. Petechial hemorrhaging to the eyes is a sign of choking. Petechial hemorrhaging to the forehead and scalp is a sign of having the breath squeezed out of you, as if someone put you in a bear hug. 8. At least 7 lacerations involve the neck. The right and left superficial jugular veins were completely transected. The right common carotid artery was completely transected. Death is due to the severed right common carotid artery. The only deep and fatal wounds in the entire autopsy are the lacerations to the neck. Absent those, Sherry Bates could have been treated in the emergency room of the local hospital and sent on her way. The simplest way to describe the autopsy is that it consists of 2 types of wounds: 1, the 7 fatal slashes to her throat, and 2, a lot of collateral nicks and cuts. When a victim is stabbed multiple times in the same small area, it usually means she has been bound or held in such a way that she couldn't avoid the blade, since otherwise a victim will try to get out of the way, as for example Cecilia Shepard did at Lake Berryessa. Sherry Bates's wound pattern means she was bound or held during the attack and couldn't get free until she was dead. Since she also had petechial hemorrhaging to her forehead and scalp, that means she was probably bear-hugged by one man, likely from the front, while a second man slashed her throat multiple times from behind. What is still more remarkable about the autopsy is not what it shows, but what it doesn't show. Sherry Bates had no defensive wounds consistent with a frontal knife attack in a pitch-dark alley. There are no cuts or bruises on the outsides of her forearms, or for that matter on the palms of her hands. A frontal knife attack is normally launched with underhand thrusts, and yet Sherry Bates had no wounds to her abdomen, and the lowest wound on her torso was a superficial slash just below her left breast. Sherry Bates being held tightly in front by one man while having her throat slashed from behind by a second man would also explain the churned-up ground beneath her. When one's arms are pinned to one's sides, one's energy is transferred to the legs and feet, which will kick out compulsively in an effort to get free. Based on her wound pattern, Sherry Bates was walked down the alley, possibly at gunpoint, and then grabbed tightly by one man, who wrapped his arms around her and pinned her own arms to her sides while ducking his head. As she was lowered to the ground, she realized she was about to be murdered and began screaming. Then the man behind her began slashing her throat, cutting off her screams. Sherry managed with a superhuman effort to get her hands free, and clawed and pulled the hair of the front man. She raised her hands to her throat and managed to misdirect the blade, causing the various shallow slashes to her upper torso. But it was too late. The Bates homicide has often been called brutal, a crime of rage. Instead, it was cold-blooded and clinical. Her murder was more like a surgical strike, with the minimum amount of violence necessary to kill the victim. Let's look at Sherry Bates's stomach. We already know she ate a meal of roast beef and vegetables and a glass of milk between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. at her house. Here is a paragraph about her stomach contents in the autopsy. The stomach contains at least 100 milliliters of thick fluid with particulate food particles in which are easily recognized reasonably large pieces of apparently beef along with vegetable particles being either an or celery and onion and white curd-like particles floating in the gastric contents that appear to be either milk or cottage cheese. The gastric contents suggest she had eaten a supper-type meal probably not more than 2 to 4 hours before death. Here's the problem with that paragraph. 100 milliliters is about 3.4 ounces of food. Since Sherry Bates was known by her friends and family to be weight-conscious, 3.4 ounces would have comprised a third to a half of the average supper she consumed. She finished eating supper before 5 p.m. that afternoon. She wasn't murdered until after 10 p.m. that night and possibly as late as 10:30. Even allowing for the longer estimate of 4 hours for food to leave her stomach, it should have been empty by 9 p.m. Instead, Sherry had a third to a half of her supper still in her stomach after 10 p.m. Keep in mind that Sherry Bates was an athletic 18-year-old former cheerleader who figured to have a relatively high metabolism. The one thing that can change the timing of digestion is stress. To quote Detective William Baker from the archived ZODIACKiller.com message board, when a person is subjected to a life-threatening situation over an extended period of time, as in cases where there is an abduction with a persistent threat of death staring them in the face, the digestive process is retarded, if not halted altogether, while the system prioritizes and rechannels its emphasis to the flight or fight areas of the body. This has been the case when such murder victims are found to have undigested food in their stomachs. Although the consensus view of the Bates murder is that she was suddenly attacked by a knife-wielding assailant in a pitch-dark alley, her stomach says she was in fear for her life over a period of several hours that night. Sherry Bates's car was disabled by pulling the middle wire from the distributor. If Sherry was abducted after she parked her car at 6:20 p.m., there would have been no need for her abductors to immediately disable the car. Disabling the car was done to fit the scenario in the confession letter, that Sherry came out of the library and tried to start her car and couldn't. Then her killer offered to help, eventually walking with her down the alley until he turned on her. Sherry's absence from the library that night and her stomach contents say the confession letter scenario is not true. The car was likely disabled shortly after she was murdered, since disabling her car before then would have meant it could not be moved. The charged-out books were then left on the front passenger seat of the car, to place her in the library. The next episode of Zodiac Killer Chronology, 3. Faraday Jensen Timeline will cover the events leading up to the Lake Herman Road murders.